Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are back with another edition of our educational speedrun series. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action with our first game of 10+0.
Zooming through the game with a bomb cloud start, trashing all your prep like it's modern art. Knight on the rim, he'll still find the win. Chat's going wild, bro thinks he's Hikaru again. Oh hey, hey, he's smurfing play-by-play, beats you blindfolded, still sipping latte. Queens are flying, eagles meet defeat, just another speed run on Hikaru Street.
All right, so here we go. First game. Now I'm going to start with move E4. Now, before we get too deep into the weeds of this video in our educational speedrun series, there is one thing that I do want to say, because recently I did see some people asking a question about the bishop pair, and specifically whether it's valuable or not, and how that relates to games at this level. Now, currently we do have a rating near 1500, but what I want to say very specifically is that when I play these games at this level, I am assuming that the people who watch this video are either here or lower. Now, of course, there are players who are much stronger, say 2000, 2200 online. And as I continue to progress with the speed run, I will obviously start to talk about more advanced concepts. But the way that I approach these games at this level is as though you're at this rating or lower. So do keep that in mind in case you're wondering about various things. So we got bishop b4 here. Now I'm going to develop my knight to e2. Now my opponent has played this classic Owens opening here with this b6, bishop b7, bishop b4. I'm going to go knight to e2 here. The reason I'm going to play knight to e2 is I reinforce the knight so that black can't take the pawn when I castle. Now after takes, I'm guarding this pawn with two pieces. So I've completed my development. I have this big white center with the pawns on e4 and d4. This opening is playable, but I don't really recommend it at the lower levels from the black side, because you're giving your opponent too much space, and you guys are about to see that I'm going to start pushing all of my opponent's forces backward. We go knight e4. I can kick this bishop, I can kick this knight, and I really have this nice knight with these two pawns here. We get castles. I can play c4, and in fact, if I go c4, what's his next move? Because if you move this knight back, I think I can just go a3 and win the bishop here. And this is actually one of the big drawbacks. I go a3, and after bishop a5, b4, this bishop is about to get completely trapped here on the edge of the board. And this is why I don't really like hyper modern openings, because a lot of the play in hyper modern openings revolves around knowing when to play in the center of the board. Like we go back somewhere. Actually, I guess I'll do it in the analysis afterwards. We'll take, hit this rook here, hit the bishop. We get d5. Now I go en passant, bishop, rook, knight, three pieces under attack. We take the rook. We're up a rook here, and now this should be pretty straightforward conversion. My opponent does have the idea to move this knight and trap the bishop on the edge of the board. So what I'm going to do here, it's actually not so obvious. If I go bishop b7, my opponent will play queen c7. My bishop won't escape. My bishop's not getting out. So I think what I'm going to play here is I'm going to play this move. I can go bishop to f4. I don't love it, but I'm going to try trade the bishops. And then my main point behind this move is that I'm way ahead because I have one extra tower. But when my opponent tries to move this knight, if I go here, there's queen c7. Okay, so my opponent has queen c7 or queen b8 to hit both the knight and the bishop at the same time. So I'm going to end up giving back one of the pieces here. But luckily, since I have one extra rook, or my opponent can play knight b8, now I'm going to go d5, try to open up all these diagonals for the bishop, try to open up the center of the board. We go d6. Now after queen takes, bishop, pawn takes, I simply have the extra rook on the board here. Let's just go queen f3, guard the knight. Bring one of the rooks to the center of the board. I simply have one extra tower here. This should be very straightforward. Let's go rook d1, trade the rooks off the board. Let's go queen d3, just try to control the only open file on the board here with the double stack. Okay, queen f6. I guess I will play knight to h5, just attack the queen. There is a free pawn here that my opponent can take. Let's see if that happens. Okay, so we get queen g5 here, attacking the knight. I guess I'll just move my queen back, guard the knight. Probably try to stack the rooks on this file if I can. Let's go rook d3, idea rook d1, or rook g3, also an idea as well. Actually, kind of nifty idea. Queen guards the knight, rook hits the pawn. This will be GG very quickly. Not a particularly interesting game overall. That's just a Botez gambit. We take the queen, simply checkmate. All right, so this opening, which was the Owens defense, I really don't generally like it from the black side, especially at the lower levels, like say you're 1500. If you're 2200, I would say, and blitz or higher, I think you can play it because you'll understand some of the themes of the pawn breaks in the center. But in general, it's very hard to play because, for example, here, say my opponent plays a move like d5, which is an option here. I can play a move like e5, and after c5, knight to f3. You really have to know how to play this French structure. So, for example, when do you want to play f6? When do you want to take? When do you want to go knight c6? How do you want to develop the bishop and the knight here? So if you move the bishop, the knight's gonna have to go here in order to castle. If you move the knight, then you need one more move to develop the bishop and castle the king. Lot about the opening, the Owens defense really revolves around the pawn structure and knowing when to play moves like d5. So when my opponent goes bishop b4, I play knight e2 here. Knight f3 is a move, but after knight f6, there's already a lot of pressure here. If I castle after takes, black has one extra pawn. If I play a move like e5 here, black can play knight to e4, and now there's some pressure on the knight on c3 here. So it's a position where white is completely fine, but there's immediately some counterplay for black. But when I go knight to e2 here, now after knight to f6 and castles, there's no instant counterplay because after takes, I take with the knight. Both the pieces guard the pawn. I don't have to really do anything right away because the center is completely compact and everything is safe, and I'm going to castle the king on the next turn. So that's why I played knight to e2. Here already the computer does not like black's position. It wants, I think, d5, e5, and something like queen d7. But even this idea of castling and playing something like bishop to e7 is very awkward. It's not a very human approach to drop a bishop back and then play c5. Again, if you're at a very high level, it's possible to play like this and understand these moves, but at a level of 1500 or say even 1000, these type of ideas are just violating the basic principles that you really need to instill in order to improve the game, which is exactly why I don't like openings of this nature, because you have to violate the principles. Now, as you get better at chess, you learn the rules and how to break them. But again, at this level, this is not what you should be looking to do. And that's exactly why I don't like these openings. So we get knight f6, I castle. Now my opponent plays h6 here. Actually a very reasonable move because probably my opponent was worried that after castles, I might play bishop g5 to pin the knight on f6. Here black can drop the bishop back and it's fine objectively, but it's actually a very reasonable idea to play h6 here to stop bishop g5 from a general standpoint. So if I look at a principled idea, I think this is actually very good, even though in this opening it's probably a bad move individually. At this level, the themes and trying to understand what you're playing for much more important than actually trying to be precise, because you cannot be precise at this level. So I go e5, knight to e4, we get castles. Now I go c4. Already here black's in all kinds of trouble. F5 is probably the best move according to the computer because you attack the knight at the same time. But I think here there are many ways to play this. One way to be very flashy is to play this line with queen b3 to hit the bishop and the pawn at the same time. All kinds of threats on the diagonals and white's winning. But even simply, you can also just move your knight back to g3, and after knight e7, it's the same problem with a3. Both these squares are covered here by the two pawns. You lose the bishop. You go to a5, there's b4 here. Bishop has no retreating square. This is also going to be GG very soon. So it's already kind of lost at this point. And the main reason that my opponent lost in this game is not understanding how to play in the center of the board. Basically, I got too much space here. I was able to push the p very quickly and everything collapsed in a hurry. And then after a3, a valiant try here. I think it was still kind of some chances. Maybe I should have played d5 right away to explode the center, but I went bishop b7. Queen c7 would have been the best move. But here I think after d5 it's still very, very good for white. Something like queen takes f4, takes, and then I don't know, even move like a b4 here, takes. Let's say queen c7 and move like queen to f3, rook to b8 here, trying to win this pawn. But after rook d1, rook takes b7, and let's just say rook c1 here. White's going to play c5. You have two open files for the two rooks, and this should be a position that you'll be able to convert more often than not from the white side. So we get a win in our first game, and here we go with the next game. Off we go. Second game, we get the black pieces. So we get b3. Now again, it's interesting. My opponent plays what we call the Nimzo-Larsen. This is also kind of like a reversed Owens like we just saw in the first game. Difference being that because I don't have the extra tempo, after d5, bishop b5, bishop d6, knight f3, I can't play knight e7. If this is a little bit too fast for you guys, I will go over this after the game. So we got to move e3. Now, I'm trying to think about what the best system is to play here from the black side again if you're at the lower levels. I think what I'm going to recommend here is to play this move which one do I think avoids the most danger? I think the one that avoids the most danger is this move a6, and the reason I'm going to play a6 is to stop this move bishop b5 here. My knight is guarding the pawn, but the bishop can try to create a lot of threats immediately, like chop this knight and win this pawn. So a6 stops any bishop b5. So now the knight is secure, guarding the pawn, and now we just play chess. What I'm going to play here is I'm going to go d6, guarding the pawn on e5 here, knight and pawn. And now let's look to finish our development, bring the knight out, bring the bishop, and castle the king. Now, this is not the most testing line. If you are a stronger player watching this video, of course there are better ways to play against the system, but I'm just trying to keep it very, very simple. So let's go rook to e8 here. My idea is to move the bishop and play d5 and try to build this big black center. It's a very closed position, which I really don't like. The lower level is very hard to understand what you're playing for. So let's go d5, build this big black center with these knights. At some point, I probably want to move the bishop and the rook, but this is a very hyper modern position. Probably the themes I'm going to be talking about, or the way I even win this game, are things that aren't going to apply at the lower level. So if you don't really understand many of my moves here, don't be too surprised, because I really think you should play positions with open diagonals and open files as much as you can at the lower level. So I'm going to go h6 here. Now, the reason I'm going to play h6 is multi-purpose. First of all, my pawn is guarded by the knight and the rook, so white can't capture the pawn. Secondarily, when I play h6, I create some Lufthansa for the king. There are no back rank checkmates. King can escape. But I have a third very tricky idea here, which is I want to put my bishop on f5, trying to pressure this diagonal, and then I eventually want to slide the bishop back to h7 if white plays knight h4. So it's multi-purpose. It creates a space for the king. It creates this diagonal for the bishop. So there are two main reasons that I play this move. So we get e4 now. We reach a position where I have to think about what to do. You'll notice that I can take, and win a pawn in the center of the board. Now, is this the best way to play the position here, or is there something better? I could play d4. I could develop a bishop maybe, although the pawn on e5 is a little bit weak. This bishop can't really be developed very easily. And then if I come back to the main thought, if I take, I'm guarding the pawn twice. And I think I'm actually just up a pawn in this position if I'm not miscalculating. We take. The pawn is still guarded by the knight and the rook. White can't take the pawn. Also, no bishop b5. Huh? This is a free piece? Okay. Well, that was a little bit weird. Not what I was expecting. A little bit disheartening, actually, because this was looking to be a very interesting middle game. But in the course of two moves, my opponent has made a couple of huge blunders. I would also point out that one thing I've said a lot is that you can get very far just by not making blunders. If you can just avoid blundering anything that's less than a piece, let's just say one pawn in a game. If you only blunder on average one pawn in a game, I think you can probably get to 17 or 1800 alone just by having that general tactical vision. Even if you're not playing like great moves or anything of that nature, just by avoiding making serious blunders, i.e. not more than one pawn per game, you'll go very far. So it's actually a really important point how avoiding blunders can be a huge difference in the level of skill. So my opponent plays rook d8. Now my opponent is trying to put pressure on all these pieces on the back rank. I'd love to move the bishop, but then I hang the rook. So this bishop is kind of stuck for the moment. What I can do, however, is I'm going to play this move knight d6, attacking this bishop. And I have a very nice idea of playing rook to e8 here, forcing this rook off the back rank here. We're probably going to get a trade, and once we get the trade, again, we're in a situation where I have 1 2 3 and a rook. My opponent has 1 2 and a rook. I have an extra minor piece here. This is a situation where I'm just going to make some easy trades, try to get this down to limited material, and I should be able to convert it very easily. Let's just go here. My idea is to play bishop f5, trade off a set of bishops. Let's go here, trade off a set of bishops. Now, again, more pieces come off the board, less of these major pieces. Let's go rook to e8, offer the trade of the rooks. The knight guards, we get rook c1. And now I'm going to play the move knight e4. Now, when I go knight e4, the reason I play this move is that this bishop is very passive. It's completely fine on f8. I'm up a piece. When I go knight to e4, now I open up all these great squares on this diagonal to attack. And very, very quickly, I think white's going to have to do something to try and trade off some pieces in the very near future. Let's see what we get here. Okay, so my opponent plays move g4. Now, I'm just going to take knight guards the bishop, move this bishop. Not even sure where to go. I guess I'll go here. And the reason I'm going to go to d7 is the bishop guards the rook. Say white has some rook e1 somewhere. The bishop guards the rook. Now, on top of guarding the rook here, the bishop can also go this way to hit the diagonal. Now, I do have to be careful here because if white can trade the bishop for the knight here, the bishop will hang. So I'm going to move the bishop back. And now you'll see the whole purpose of this bishop move. If rook to e1 occurs, I can move the knight away. My bishop guards the rook, so the trade is just simply an even trade. Again, with 3 minor pieces versus 2, I'm more than happy to do an even trade of the rooks, or frankly, any piece. Could be the bishops, bishop for knight, rooks, any even trade here. I'm very happy just because I have the one extra piece on the board. So we get the move knight to h4. I'm going to go bishop c6 here. Now you start to see the power of the 2 bishops on these unopposed diagonals pointing towards the white king. I'm going to play rook to d8 here. Just attack this bishop. My bishop guards the knight. Try to activate this rook, create some kind of threats on the second rank here. Should be many ways to win here, but I'm just trying to force some even trades. Now after rook to d2 here, this looks very close to a checkmate. I'm not sure what my opponent will do. Maybe knight g2. Logical. I think if I move my knight here, I just hit this knight with the bishop and the rook. That hangs the rook. I can take. Let's take. Now I have multiple ways. Should be a checkmate very soon. My opponent just decides to resign. Okay, so let's take a look at the analysis. So at the start, we got b3. Now, very similar to the previous game, except that in this case, I'm black. So if I try to play d5 here, after bishop b5, bishop d6, and knight f3, now you'll notice I'm 1 tempo behind because I'm playing with the black pieces. So if I go knight e7, white can simply take this pawn. I can't take back with the knight because of the pin. Whereas from the white side, if I just flip this for 1 second, just so you guys understand exactly what I'm saying, in this exact line with bishop b7, like e6, here, you'll notice that in this position, it's white's turn, so white can castle. Whereas when we go back to this position from the black side here, let's flip the board again. From the black side here, you're 1 tempo behind because obviously white has the first move. So this whole like Nimzo Owens setup from the white side with b3 is not as bad as from the black side because it's the first move. So I played a6 here. The point was that I was a little bit worried that if I go knight f6, there's bishop b5 here, undermining the knight and the pawn here. So that's why I played a6, no bishop b5, meaning this knight really is anchored to this pawn. No way to harass the knight and force a trade to weaken this point. So we got this. I played d6, bishop e2, all pretty standard here. We reach a closed middle game here where played d5. We get e4 here. Normally you'd probably see a move like rook to e1, and then my idea is bishop to f5, so that if white goes knight h4, I can retreat this bishop and keep some ideas of spying this diagonal in the long term. This is a position that's all about the middle gameplay. There are no concrete plans for either side. Probably if you're playing from the white side, you're going to try to go a3 and c4 or b4 somewhere in here. If you're playing from the black side, you're probably going to look to play something like bishop to d6. So let's just say you got some moves like knight to d2, maybe something like bishop d6 and e4 to open up some diagonals. Another idea would just be to play something simple like queen to d7 and then rook a d8, and at some point looking to push one of these pawns in the center of the board. But this is a middle game where there are no concrete plans. All the files are closed, and these are positions that I really think you should aim to avoid if possible in your games at this level, because when you don't have clear-cut plans, you have to maneuver, put pieces on diagonals. This is a lot harder to do. This is a more advanced skill, and that's why a lot of times in many openings from the white side, I suggest openings like the Scotch, for example, because when you get openings like the Scotch opening here, it's very easy to develop. You put the bishop on c4 or b5, you castle, they're open files, open diagonals. It's a lot easier to play than when you get positions like this where it's very closed and it's all about maneuvering the pieces. I don't really like these positions at the beginner level, so I would try to avoid them when possible. In this game, I was unable to. So we get e4, which is just a blunder because it's just a free pawn here. I guard twice, my opponent blunders. I'm able to just force the trade. Now we reach a simple position, which is just very easy to convert. So let's move on to our next game. Here we go. Next game. Let's start with the move e4. Since I was just talking about the Scotch opening, let's play e4, knight f3. And sure enough, we'll get knight c6, I assume. Okay, let's go d4. Now, as I just mentioned, I really like open positions. You can play bishop to c4. This is a move, the Italian, but the Italian, much like our previous game, it tends to lead to closed positions where it's all about pawn breaks in the center of the board. Don't even consider the Italian opening, at least not the traditional slow version of it, unless you're, I would say, at least 2000 in Blitz online. Do not consider it if you're below 2000 online. Now, after the game, I'll explain a couple things about it, like the exceptions that I think do exist if you're going to look to play it, but the traditional one, avoid at all costs unless you're over 2000. So we get d6. Okay, so the question here is which side to develop. Now I can develop the bishop and castle the king. Actually, c4, d3, castle the king makes a lot of sense. I can also look to develop the knight, the bishop, and castle queen side. Now, because my opponent has no development here, and based on my queen being so centralized where it spies a couple of pawns, I think I'm going to look to develop my queen side first and go for a quick queenside castle here, mainly because my opponent can't really castle queenside. So if my opponent tries to do the same thing, you're going to hang this pawn on a7 and lose the game. So very quickly, I've got a lot of play here in the center of the board, and I think we're going to see a situation where I convert this very cleanly, although knight e7 is a phenomenal move. That is a phenomenal move at this level. I did not expect this move. So let's just castle. I'm going to go right for it. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play bishop b5, pinning this knight. Now, the reason I'm going to do this, if I were to move the queen, my opponent can finish the development very quickly, whereas now that's not the case because I can take this pawn on g7 here, since the queen still was spying this pawn, so the development wasn't super easy to finish. So we get bishop f6, excellent move. Queen guards the bishop, bishop guards the rook. Question is, I have two squares. I can go to h6 or g3. Both moves have merit here. The one that I'm going to go for in this position, I think, is queen to h6. And the reason I'm going to go for queen to h6 over queen g3 is simply because the queen spies this bishop, so black can't just develop the queen. I'm always spying this bishop. We take the bishop here. And now, on top of the queen being back on g3, the secondary point behind this move that's really, really good is now I can play this move bishop g5, or do I want to go queen f6? Multiple options here. I can't really let my opponent castle. Well, I can, and I'm still going to win, but I think I really want to stop my opponent from castling the king. So we'll go bishop g5. Now with the queen on h6, all these squares are super tricky here for black to deal with. I think the move I'm going to play is just simply, could go queen to f6, could go queen to g7, could just move the bishop. So many options. I'm just going to move my bishop back. Now, if we get b5, I'll go bishop to b3 here. Happy to trade. I really want to keep this king in the center, though, because my queen side is a little bit weak here. We get bishop takes a2. Now, the move that I'm going to play here is a dynamite move. When we look at this position here, the material is even, but black has a big issue, which is that this king cannot castle. The bishop covers a square here on d8. The king cannot castle as the queen covers a square on f8. So because this king is so bad on e8 here, I'm going to try to explode the position immediately here with the two bishops and using these two open files here. And I think this is going to end very, very badly for my opponent, but let's see if my opponent can at least defend for a few more moves. It's a very, very tough position to play. So many threats here with rook to e1 incoming. The center of the board is open, and this king, this poor king, just cannot escape easily. So we get the move d5. Now, after d5, there are some options. What I'm going to play here is I'm actually going to go e6. And the reason I'm going to play e6 here is that my opponent has kind of temporarily stopped the attack in the middle of the board. If I were to go rook e1, which is a move that I think a lot of humans would consider right off, trying to play for e6, I think my opponent can play queen to e6, and I'm not going to be able to open up the center of the board here. So I'm going to go for a temporary pawn sacrifice. If queen takes, I have rook to e1. And after pawn takes and rook to e1 here, there's huge pressure. I'm really forcing open these files on the e and d files here after rook to e1, and it's very hard for black to defend this pawn on e6. The king is still stuck. You cannot castle through either of these squares here. So if you can't castle the king, something really bad is about to happen. And also, you'll notice these two rooks are stuck on these squares. This unfortunately hangs the queen, and the game's going to end almost instantly. My opponent just resigns. Very tough game here. Again, one of the things I really like about the Scotch, as you see in this game, is the easy development. Now, I didn't move the queen here, which probably if I were playing a stronger player, I would move the queen. The reason I didn't move the queen in this game is that I really want to keep the queen spying these pawns here. Maybe actually computer says this is just as good, because after a6 takes an f4 very quickly, there's a lot of pressure in the center of the board, and you can't, if you move the bishop, you hang this pawn, obviously. So it's very hard to castle the king. You don't really ever want to castle the king this way, because there's going to be some queen a7, all kinds of threats with these weak compromised pawns near the king. So it's very hard to finish the development here. Which is why I played bishop e5. Queen e2, of course, is also completely fine, but after bishop to e7, black will at least get to castle. And now you're gonna have to understand themes like f4, f5, maybe pushing the pawns on the king's side. This turns into something that becomes much more complex, whereas when I play bishop b5, I keep an eye on both these pawns with the queen. I'm always happy to trade, and I really try to stop my opponent from finishing the development. Now it'll probably be, realistically, it's actually I think very reasonable to try and keep these ideas in mind at the 1600 level of preventing your opponent's development when possible. Like, you know, you'll notice here that one of the great things, actually the reason I said 97 was a great move is because black struggles to do the standard development of getting the king out of the center. Maybe knight f6 is possible, but I think this is also very, very dangerous here. There are all kinds of threats if you take the pawn. I think there's takes, there's pressure on the queen, move the queen, there's like bishop c4 apparently, and takes, there's bishop c5. This is actually very, very, very advanced stuff. But even like knight b5 here, putting pressure on the pawn would be very, very strong, and black is just a little bit behind in development. I think in most of the games that we've played so far, that actually is the single biggest reason I'm winning most of the games, besides the obvious fact that I'm just stronger, is that I'm completing the development quicker. My opponents are struggling to finish the development. You could say they don't understand the opening theory as well, perhaps, but they are oftentimes wasting time, and I'm able to finish development before they do. I would say probably like 95% of these games. That's the biggest difference, is that that my opponents end up in a situation like this where they struggle to finish the king development by castling it, and usually something bad happens before they can finish the development. We got bishop to e7, queen h6. The reason I went to h6 versus g3 was simply after takes. I thought that after queen to f6 the pawn is weak, maybe even just queen to e7 trying to castle here. Something along these lines is still completely winning for white if you're a strong enough player. But when I go queen to h6 here, I really do keep these squares alive in this position, g7 and f6 for the queen. Just a sample line would be something like queen g3, takes, queen d7, bishop g5, and now after rook to g8, black at least can put some pressure on the file. It's still very good for white, but the queen on h6 is just so much more effective with both these squares available than it would have been had I retreated to g3. So I go here to spy the bishop. We get the trade, queen d7, very logical move, trying to castle. I cut off the castling mechanism here with the bishop. King can't go through the center of the board. Get a6, takes, and now I play the move e5 here. And the main reason, of course, is that in this position, my opponent has not completed development. The king is stuck in the middle of the board. You can't go through these two squares, as I've already mentioned plenty of times in this video. So with this king stuck on e8 here, it makes sense to try and attack immediately. I've got the rook on the open file, the bishops are great on the diagonals, queen is great too, and now the rook also can come to the center of the board. So all the white pieces have achieved perfect harmony. We get d5, and now I play e6, and this is actually a very important moment, because I think most players would play rook to e1 thinking I'm just going to go e6, but after queen to e6 here, what you'll notice is that somehow the rook is on this file behind the pawn, but you can't force this pawn forward. The queen stops it. This rook also can't become active. This pawn is just guarded, so somehow these two rooks are now just not very active on these files. White is still technically winning. A strong player would still win, but it's going to require a lot of work here. Whereas when I go e6 here and rook to e1, now this pawn is weak on e6, this pawn on d5 is weak, this king is still stuck in the middle, and all the white pieces have achieved perfect harmony. And in fact, sacrificing the pawn is temporary because my opponent has not completed development, and at this point it's already almost resignable. Computer wants d4 here, trying to defend the pawn on this backwards diagonal, but there's rook takes d4 due to this pin on this diagonal. Just a position that's completely lost. We get knight e7, I take, and I win the game. So we're gonna do one more game. Hopefully we'll get through the opening without winning before my opponent finishes development. All right, so let's play a center counter. Now this is an opening that I really like. I think it's a strong opening. When your opponent plays e5, very easy. c5, grip some center, develop the knight, bishop to f5. We're gonna get d4 to guard this, creating, or not, we get f4. Now I'm still gonna go bishop to f5 followed by e6 here to create the chain of pawns. Okay, let's go e6 here. I've got the chain of 3, the pawn, the knight, everything's very, very cleanly developed. The question here is, how do I develop the king side? Now, in the first game, I mentioned that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to develop the king side if you can't bring the knight and the bishop out and castle like you do in probably like 85-90% of normal openings that are not, say, the Caro-Kann or French specifically, like e4, e5, you're always going to go knight f6, bishop e7, and castle. Here it's a little bit trickier because I don't have the square available for the knight, so I can't get the standard development on the king side. So we get h4. Now this is actually a very bad move because I can play h5 here, and this creates some serious light square weaknesses here for my opponent. Get bishop to e2. I think I'm just going to go g6, guarding the pawn on h5. Not the best move technically. but it is still completely fine. Let's just, now we've got to figure out how to develop. Now, because my opponent has created all these light square weaknesses here, I'm going to put my knight on h6. Now, it's a very unusual development. You're not going to see this almost at all unless you play the Caro-Kann, the French, or the modern systems, trying to put a knight on the rim here. But because I have so much grip on all these light squares here, it's very easy to finish the development and bring the knight to either g4 or f5 down the road. I probably will still go bishop to e7 to castle the king, but I have figured out the right piece placement thus far. So let's develop the bishop, look to castle the king, of course. I don't really know what a4 does. You just take the pawn, you push, I take the pawn. Not really a move that adds a whole lot of value, I would say, for my opponent. Get g3. All right, I think I'm just going to castle. I'm not too worried. My king side is very safe with the 3 pawns. I've gotten the king out of the center of the board. One thing that's going to happen in the next move or two is I do intend to push my pawn to d4, and the reason I intend to push this pawn is that this bishop is very, very passive. I meant to go d4. I meant to go d4 and I just grabbed the knight. Okay, well, we're still going to win, but this makes it more interesting. Okay, so now that I'm down a piece by accident, we've got to go for quick attack. So I'm gonna go rook c8. We'll probably get the trade. I'm gonna take with the bishop, and I'm going to look to do something before my opponent castles the king, similar to what I've mentioned in the previous game. I'm going to try to do something before my opponent finishes development. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces on their original squares. Let's go knight g4, attack the bishop. Get queen d2. Now, I feel like my opponent is trying to mess this up a little bit. I don't have the problem is I don't have a great way to win this position. I could take. I'm going to take, and then I'm going to take this pawn and go bishop c5 perhaps to try to pin this knight on this diagonal. Seems like a reasonable approach, at least. Whoa, queen d4. Whoa, but now I have rook c1 check. There is bishop d1 to stop the threats, but it's a fairly serious error in my view. I'm going to go bishop c5 to attack the queen. Rook guards the bishop. I'm going to have to go queen to a4 here. Maybe white's still winning, but it looks pretty scary now, because when I queen c7, there's knight c3 maybe. Okay, how do I do this? b5. I'm going to play b5. This is probably not a great move, but I'm going to play it because if my opponent takes, that activates the queen and I get a double stack on the diagonal. If my opponent takes with the queen, one of the big reasons I play this move is that white could move the knight and I can't take the rook. But even though I gambit a pawn here, now if the knight goes, you lose the rook. Back here, where I just say play queen c7, white moves the knight, queen guards the rook. So I sack a pawn, which at this point, since I'm down a piece, doesn't really matter that much. I also have rook b8 here to attack the queen, attack on the file. And white is really stuck. You can't move the knight without hanging this rook on a1 here. So this rook is hanging on a1. I'm threatening to go rook to b8 and hit the pawn on b2. This is actually a very hard position for my opponent to play. Very, very difficult, in fact. I think the best move might just be queen to a4 to move this knight and guard the rook on a1. Let's see if that's what we get. I don't think it'll be played here. I think we'll get a different move. No, he does play queen to a4. Okay, so let's go rook to b8. We're going to attack this pawn on b2. And this is a very, very critical moment in the game. If my opponent plays the right move, knight to c3, white is still probably... I don't know if white's winning. White's still probably better. But any other move, and I think something bad's going to happen. Like we got rook to h2. It's a very creative move to guard this pawn on b2. I could take this pawn on d3. I can also throw in the check. I think I'm just going to... if I take, there's knight to c3. We go check. Still probably losing. Still probably losing. Maybe I have rook b4, actually. Rook b4. Queen to a2. Still probably losing. Okay, let's go bishop b4. I'm going to check the king. Rook guards the bishop. When my opponent moves the knight, I think I'm just going to take this pawn on d3, try to use the two bishops. I'm still down a piece, still probably completely lost objectively, but this actually just loses the game, because now I hit the king, and I hit the rook at the same time. I'll explain why it's so important to stop the knight from coming to c3 after the game, but this is also just GG now. I hit the king, I hit the rook. We get rook d2, I take the rook, queen guards the rook. Extra material, rook to b1 incoming here. Should be a very, actually queen d4 I think is the only move here, with the knight guarding the queen. Oh, there's also queen c2 I suppose. Here I'm more than happy to trade. Again, I've got a rook for a piece, rook for a minor piece, rook for a knight. Let's go for the double stack to hit the bishop. It's also a pin on the king. Probably gonna get rook to d2 to guard this bishop, but after rook d2, bishop g4, the problem is everything is overloaded here. The two rooks, the bishop, the knight, the king, all the pieces are just too loose. I'm gonna win something here, be up even more material. It's already a rook for a knight. It's gonna be at least a full rook after the next move or two if my opponent doesn't resign. We get king to f2. I'll take the bishop here. Let's take extra rook on the board. Only a lone pony here. Should not be any difficulties converting the game. I'm gonna go rook to a3. There are many ways to win, but I just don't want to give my opponent any chance to start pushing this pawn, so I'm more than happy to give this one up. For this one now, it's just pawns on files. No way for white to push past pawns. Let's just go rook to a4. Don't want to hang the rook, of course. Okay, let's start pushing the pawn. Probably I'll go check and just push p through. Check. No forward squares here. It's all covered. Start pushing the pawn. Black, I guess white is knight f6 to try and get the knight back, but it's not going to change the outcome of the game. I'll just go here. Pre-move pawn takes bishop. Now I just have a rook and a pawn. This is very simple. I'm actually just going to walk the king all the way up the board. Okay, let's just go like here, I guess, just to cut the king off one way or the other. Now we'll just go around, bring the king up. Here we go. White pushes either pawn, it just takes. I'm just going to walk the king up. Let's take. Both pawns are covered here. Walk the king. And checkmate. There we go. So we got the win. This was, of course, not a perfect game. If we go back to start, one thing I would mention here is that normally in these positions, if you're playing from the white side where you get one of these structures, it could be like this. It could also be you get a structure like this. Very rarely almost never do you want to play h4 where your opponent can stop the pawn push and you create weaknesses on the light squares. I think one of the only lines where that's relatively okay is in the classic Caro-Kann. So if you reach the advanced Caro-Kann just to set up, there are lines like h4, but even when you play h4, you never go f4 because that creates this big weakness on the g4 square. That's just a general note that anytime you reach a position like this, h4, when your opponent can play h5 and just grip the square where you can't push the pawn, this is terrible. This is the worst possible pawn structure. Usually occurs out of the French or the Caro-Kann because obviously this pawn structure is very unique to the French and the Caro-Kann system specifically. Probably if you're looking to play some idea on the king side, it'd be better to play like h3 and then some knight f3 here, just because even if black goes h5 here and let's just say knight to h6 as an example here, you aren't really giving up a ton of weakness on the light squares here. Black's still a little bit better according to the computer, but you don't create this huge hole that's going to last for the rest of the game. Whereas here, these two squares, like even for example, another idea, black can play something like knight to h6 and knight to f5 here. Big pressure on h4. Black's can develop very easily. I won't get into why black is super better. Mostly what I will say is the pawn structure. You never want the structure from the white side where you get these pawns and there's this huge problem. If black can ever get this structure with h4 h5 and use this pawn on f4, these two pawns very specifically, and this huge square on g4, this is just a complete disaster. You never want this pawn structure. And even if it doesn't mean your opponent can always take advantage, it's something to remember even in spite of that. Because coming back to what I said at the start of the video about pawn structures and like what you can utilize at this level, even if your opponent can't punish you for it at this level, you still want to internalize that you never want to create these sorts of weaknesses with these two pawns where you can't push the pawn. As an example, if you get this position, this is completely fine for white because white at some point can play g4, whether it's right away, whether it's bishop e2 g4. But in this position, once black gets h5 here, there's just huge weakness here for the rest of the game. We go forward. Of course, knight d4 is not the move. I meant to go d4 here. And the reason I meant to play d4 is that you really put this bishop in jail, and this pawn on d3 is now a permanent target. If white can go d4 here, the bishop is great on the diagonal, but there isn't a perma target the way that there is here after the move d4, because now this bishop is walled in by the pieces. You have no scope on either diagonal. There's this permanent weakness here. Let's say white goes c4. The pawn is hanging, but even if we disregard the pawn, probably the most effective plan here for black would be to go knight g4, and at some point play knight to e3 and look to put massive pressure on this pawn on d3 as quickly as possible. So of course I didn't do that. Of course I mouse slipped with knight d4. We got this position here. And now probably the big mistake that I would say for my opponent was that my opponent got very greedy here. My opponent could have played something very simple like castles and just given up this pawn on d4 and completely ignored everything and just very calmly finished the development. So for example, say I played bishop c5, knight d2, knight g4, knight b3 here. Bishop covers this e3 square and you're putting pressure on the pawns. And even after knight e3, let's just say takes, and something like queen b3 here, white has an extra knight on f3. You can bring the rooks to the c file here. The extra material will play and white will win the game. But what happened here is my opponent tried too hard to actually finish the complete development of the queen side before finishing the king side development. Knight takes d4 would still be winning, but it at least becomes a touch tricky with this pin. But after queen d4, I get the check. Now there's this, and actually already here it's very hard for white to play. Now I played b5, and you're probably thinking, why did I sack the pawn? Remember, I'm already down a piece here, so pawns don't matter that much. But secondarily, because I'm down a piece, I need to create counterplay immediately. If my opponent can finish the development, say I play like queen e7 and you get knight c3 here, takes, I don't have the rooks on the board. White is eventually going to find a way to castle a king or force more trades. I mean, maybe it's not super easy because this is hanging, but the point is I need to do something immediately because I am down by a knight or 3 points. So I go b5 here, and again, it's mainly because after the knight moves, a set of rooks is going to come off the board. If my opponent were to take, now after queen b6, I have this very nasty threat on these diagonals here. b2 is weak as well. It's just a very, very tough position for white to play. And when we get takes, I move the queen. Now white has gained an extra pawn here on top of the extra knight, but you can't move the knight because you lose this rook, which is unguarded on the a1 square. So I don't mind giving up the pawn. I play rook b8. We get rook h2 here. This is a mistake. Probably knight d2 or knight c3 both would have made more sense. Knight d2 being the probably preferred move. After takes, apparently black is okay here because the king can't really get out of jail, but it shouldn't be losing for white after bishop to e2. We get rook to h2. Now I play check here. This cuts off the knight c3, which is what was played in the game. If white goes knight d2 here, I can simply take the pawn, and after takes, there's massive pressure here with the bishops cutting off this white king. Apparently black's just winning here. I'm not quite sure why exactly after rook f2. Apparently I can just like play bishop c5, rook goes, and I guess I have rook takes b2, and eventually something's going to collapse, so I don't see the win immediately. Like say queen to e8, king g7, knight g5. I guess just rook b7 here, guarding the pawn, and black's going to win this game. But to me, looking at this as a human, especially keeping in mind that the people who are watching this video are much lower rated, this is all fairly irrelevant in general in terms of black being winning. But that's why I played the check, is because I really didn't want this knight coming to c3 here, and my opponent does of course play knight c3, which then just loses the game because I win the rook. But I played this move specifically for that reason, because I felt that if I, like, say I go king g7 and the knight gets to c3 here, the knight is simply a much better piece on c3 versus d2. I think it's because white can move the rook and then play like knight d4 here, whereas with the knight on d2 it's a little bit esoteric. But after the knight is on d2 and say we get this position and takes, I guess the main point is the knight going to b3, there's always a bishop b4 check, and this knight doesn't really have great squares. You don't have e4 or c4, so the knight is simply not as well placed. Very esoteric, not something that's really applicable or matters that much, but still worth pointing out nonetheless. So we got knight c3, and now of course the rest is just, I mean, very, very straightforward. I'm just up a rook and I win very easily. So in spite of this unfortunate slip with knight to d4 instead of pawn to d4, we still do win the game in spite of that. So this video is, I'm going to conclude it. This is one of the longer speedrun videos we've done, running nearly 50 minutes. So hope you guys enjoyed the 4 games. All the games had something very, very flavorful to them. But that's going to do it for our latest edition of our educational speedrun series. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with more great educational content in the very near future. See you guys soon. Bye.